Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. President Trump says he is not providing cover for Saudi Arabia over the disappearance of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Khashoggi, a Washington Post columnist and critic of the Saudi government, was last seen entering the country's consulate in Istanbul 2 weeks ago. Saudi officials initially denied any responsibility in his disappearance, but earlier this week, they were reportedly preparing to admit he was killed in a, quote, interrogation gone wrong. Now, the New York Times is reporting that there are audio recordings of Khashoggi's killing. The Times cited Turkish officials who said those recordings suggest Khashoggi was dismembered alive and beheaded. At the White House Wednesday, President Trump said he would address the situation with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Pompeo visited with the leaders of Saudi Arabia and Turkey this week and said he was not giving the Saudis the benefit of the doubt. The president also emphasized Saudi Arabia's denial of involvement in Khashoggi's disappearance and highlighted the importance of the country's relationship with the United States.
I'm not giving cover at all. With that being said, Saudi Arabia has been a very important ally of ours in the Middle East. We are stopping Iran. We're not trying to stop, we're stopping Iran. They are an ally. We have other very good allies in the Middle East, but if you look at Saudi Arabia, they're an ally and they're a tremendous purchaser of not only military equipment, but other things. They're an important ally, but I want to find out what happened, where is the fault, and we will probably know that by the end of the week. But Mike Pompeo is coming back. We're going to have a long talk.
Mr. Trump also singled out the Associated Press for reporting that he was criticizing condemnation of Saudi Arabia. In a tweet, he wrote, quote, AP headline was very different from my quote and meaning in the story. They just can't help themselves. Fake news. In an interview Tuesday, the president told an AP reporter, quote, here we go again with you're guilty until proven innocent. That's a reference to the backlash against Brett Kavanaugh during his confirmation process. The president felt there was a rush to judgment in that controversy and appears to feel the same way with Saudi Arabia. Critics say President Trump's reluctance to criticize Saudi Arabia is similar to how he handled his July summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin. During a news conference after that summit, the president blamed both countries for the state of U.S. and Russia relations and appeared to accept Mr. Putin's denial that Russia meddled in the 2016 election.
I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today. And what he did is an incredible offer. He offered to have the people working on the case come and work with their investigators with respect to the 12 people. I think that's an incredible offer.
Joining me now are Gabe DeBenedetti and Hunter Walker. Gabe is a national correspondent for New York Magazine, and Hunter is a White House correspondent for Yahoo News. Welcome to you both. Let's start with this. Former Vice President Joe Biden sat down for an interview with CBS This Morning co-host Norah O'Donnell Wednesday. They discussed the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi. Let's listen to that.
Do you have doubts about the leadership of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman?
I do, and I have, and I think they've been confirmed.
What doubts did you have?
My doubts are that there is very little sense of rule of law, respect for human rights, dignity, and the allegations that are made so far, I don't know yet, are not inconsistent with the way the kingdom would act, so I'm very worried that the president seems to have a love affair with autocrats. And
President Trump.
President Trump, yeah. And the idea that he's already making excuses before the facts are known is typical, but it hurts us internationally.
If the allegations are true and that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia ordered the killing of this Saudi dissident who wrote a column for the Washington Post, should there be consequences?
Absolutely, positively. This was a permanent American resident. He had a permanent green card. This is as close as you can get to citizenship. He lived here. And the idea that we would not take retaliation against them is ridiculous.
What kind of retaliation? What can we do?
Well, we could cancel the arms sales. Look, They're not doing a whole lot to change the equation in the Middle East. They got us involved in a war indirectly by using our equipment that is killing thousands of innocent people.
This is Yemen.
Yeah. So I just don't know why this administration seems to feel the need to coddle autocrats and dictators, from Putin to Kim Jong-un to, Duarte. I mean, I don't understand it.
All right, Hunter, a lot to unpack there, but let's start with what the former vice president just said about seeming to coddle autocrats. Have the president's actions warranted that type of criticism?
Well, I think there's a big difference between Trump's seeming embrace of the Philippine leader Duterte and what's going on in Saudi Arabia. I've been talking to people in and around the White House all week, and one of the lines is that, Saudi Arabia is very central to all of our major foreign policy priorities in the Middle East. And, their question is, do we want to, quote unquote, blow that up for the death of one person, even if it was a, U.S. permanent resident who lived in Virginia? And those goals include the situation in Syria, the situation in Yemen, where Saudi strikes are, killing civilians en masse. Of course, the big peace plan, where we do need, some Arab buy-in, and Saudi Arabia could help us get that. And, then there's this situation with Khashoggi and confronting Iran. So the Saudi Arabian relationship is going to be much more complex than, say, Kim Jong-un or Duterte, because we need things from them. But I've actually asked President Trump, do you still think you have leverage given their investment here and, given the importance? And his line is that, we are the most powerful country in the world militarily and economically, so we will always have leverage. But right now it does certainly seem like the White House is, reluctant to fully tangle with the Crown Prince.
So, Gabe, let me ask you more about that, because I know Hunter's been talking to people in the administration who are basically laying out what might seem to some people to be a very cold geopolitical calculus, that in fact the United States needs Saudi Arabia for many reasons, as he just has spelled out, and that when you look at a threat like Iran, for instance, having this kind of conflict escalate over one life on balance is something that they don't feel is particularly helpful for the United States.
But there's a reason, of course. That's all correct, and that is what the White House has been saying. But there is a reason that this is a broader calculation. And I think what the former vice president was talking about there was not necessarily that he disagrees with the fact that it's a very complex situation and that Saudi Arabia is not a top ally in a number of these ways. But there is a concern among critics of the administration, including a number of Republicans, that they're focusing too much on the economic relationship and they're not thinking about issues like human rights, or at least they're not putting those first and forefront. And one of the major criticisms that we often hear these days of this administration's foreign policy, whether it comes to Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, or now in Saudi Arabia, is by not standing up when a country does something like this, they are essentially giving free rein to people to violate human rights elsewhere, and basically sending the message that the United States is no longer going to be in the role that it has traditionally been in, at least for the last few decades, of stepping in and saying, we're going to police this. This is not okay, not on our watch.
Yeah, it's interesting because Fran Townsend, who's a former Homeland Security advisor to George W. Bush, talked about how if there is no consequence here for Saudi Arabia, it will be open season on dissidents and journalists, she said.
And by the way, the former vice president did say this part, but the very fact that this is a permanent resident of the United States, and we're talking about this in terms of, well, it's just one life, that's not a calculation we've ever really seen in these terms, in such cold terms from an administration, at least not recently.
So, Hunter, let's add to this. You have now this New York Times report, which we spelled out at the top of the hour. How is the administration reacting to that? And does that increase pressure at all on the White House to punish the Saudis?
Well, there's certainly a ton of pressure on the White House right now to punish the Saudis. And I think, Gabriel's totally right with some of the nuance there about, what could be wrong with this. I mean, it could impact our ability to rescue American citizens in trouble in the future. And it certainly could erode our moral standing as sort of the leader of the free world. But I think the proof will be in the pudding. And, what I've heard, particularly from one former official, is that, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, he was named by his father father fairly recently. They actually chose to upend the planned order of succession. And since then, Salman went on this charm offensive in the States, in Silicon Valley and Hollywood, where he said, I'm going to modernize Saudi Arabia. He was, largely responsible for women being allowed to drive there. But at the same time, he had all these autocratic tendencies. So there's the argument that the White House is ignoring those autocratic tendencies. And what I've heard is that, Jared Kushner and others who've been working really closely with the Saudis, maybe Jared particularly bought into that, spiel about Mohammed in the beginning. But since then, they're very clear-eyed. So really the question is what happens next? And the White House line is we're pushing for an investigation and then we'll decide what to do. So there's a ton of pressure on them to do something, very strongly, and we'll see if that pans out.
So, Gabe, what about this comparison when you look at how the president has approached the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to how, in fact, he handled that situation in which he stood side by side next to Vladimir Putin and, the controversy over meddling in the 2016 election? A lot of people look at that situation and they say this is a pattern now where the United States president is abdicating a leadership role that has really been the United States alone for decades. Is that a fair comparison to look at those situations in the same way?
Broadly speaking, it's a fair comparison when you look at the broad contours of what we're talking about here. But when you look at what Hunter was just saying, which I think is absolutely correct in terms of what the White House line is, what we're seeing again and again is that the White House line, well, that may be the official capital W, capital H line, but that's not what the President Trump is actually saying when he sits down for interviews about these things or when he sits down for or stands up for press conferences. But it's not just when it comes to autocratic leaders that he essentially says, well, we have to listen to what they say. If they deny it, then they deny it. I mean, this is a pattern that goes back to Vladimir Putin, but it also goes back to Roy Moore, for example, the former Senate candidate in Alabama. This is what the president does, especially when powerful men are accused of things like this. He says, well, listen, they deny it, so it's dangerous for us not to believe them.
Hunter, I want to go back to your reporting regarding Jared Kushner's role in the administration. You talk about in your latest piece that he's very, very involved, according to the people that you've talked to, deeply involved in the White House's response to Khashoggi's disappearance. Can you tell us more about that? And how has Kushner's position evolved regarding Saudi Arabia?
Right. Well, as I was saying earlier, the Crown Prince was named fairly recently and had this sort of great reputation, financed by a very, very expensive PR operation. And since Trump took office, he and Jared developed a close relationship. What I've heard is that in this White House push for an investigation, and they're specifying that they want Turkish participation in any probe, there's really 4 people involved. President Trump is leading the way and communicating with the Saudi king. Then Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, he's traveled to Saudi Arabia and he's sort of leading the team under the president, which includes Jared and National Security Advisor John Bolton. Bolton's coordinating with the president, and Jared is leveraging that relationship he has to serve as a line of communication between the White House and the Saudis. But what I have heard is some of what I was touching on earlier, that it may be true that Jared has a close relationship with Salman, and he may have even been, one former official said, quote, naive about the Crown Prince earlier on. But at this point, they insist that Jared really understands that this is an autocratic country. One source familiar with the situation told me Jared is a, quote, pragmatist, and that, he knows Saudi Arabia won't turn into a democracy overnight. Again, I just go to, I think everything Gabriel said was right, that there are some worrying trend lines here, and we're going to have to see what happens. I mean, the White House is kind of buying themselves time and punting the question until we get the results of this investigation. Once we do, if Saudi Arabia is indeed found definitively responsible, how strong will the response be?
All right. As you've been speaking, Hunter, we've been getting some more sound in from that interview Norah O'Donnell did with former Vice President Joe Biden, this time about the Mueller investigation. Let's listen to that.
The Mueller investigation, the special counsel into influence in the 2016 election. Do you believe that report should be issued before the midterms?
I think it'd be issued when they finish the investigation. I've been around a long time. You wait till the investigation is finished. You don't put an arbitrary end to it. You wait till it's finished, and let's see what it has to say.
And if Democrats win the House, do you believe that they may move forward with articles of impeachment?
I hope they don't. I don't think there's a basis for doing that right now. I think we should wait until the report comes out.
All right, so Gabe, let me ask you, when you hear the former vice president say that, what goes through your mind?
Well, he's being safe. It sounds like he's using strong words here, but for someone who is, of course, considering running for president himself, he's saying exactly what every other Democrat in leadership says, which is wait till the end of this investigation. Democrats know that they can't overplay their hand here, and if, for example, Biden was to say, which let's be clear, he did not, let's go ahead and impeach this guy, they know that that's the news story, and that would turn out Republicans in the midterm elections. So right now they're trying to play it very safe. They're just saying we're going to wait till the end of the investigation. Listen, the real question here is once some sort of report does come out, if it does, in the way that many people are expecting, then what does Joe Biden say? For now, he's saying exactly what he's been saying.
What are your thoughts on it, Hunter? Because it was interesting, during the debate, the Texas Senate debate last night, you heard Senator Cruz raise the specter of impeachment and trying to go after Congressman Beto O'Rourke. What are your thoughts when you hear the former Vice President Biden there saying that, no, we shouldn't necessarily just move forward with articles of impeachment. We need to wait and see what the Mueller report actually says?
Well, I think it's interesting in light of our earlier conversation because there are actually parallels between how the vice president is handling this question and how the White House is handling the Saudi situation. He's essentially buying time by saying, I need to see the results of a report. And that'll work for now, but I think, this impeachment question is not going away. And Republicans are indeed, it's a very interesting thing because the Republicans are eager to push the notion that Democrats could do that if they take back the House. They clearly, I think, feel confident that that would turn out Republican voters. And, we've seen models showing that if Democratic turnout is lower than Republican turnout, Republicans will have a very slim majority and keep the House. Whereas if the Dem base turns out in full, the Dems will take over the House. So I get the game the Republicans are playing here. The Democrats also have their own tightrope to walk because I think there are a lot of segments of the base that really would like to see an impeachment push. Meanwhile, it could turn off more moderate voters.
All right, less than 3 weeks to go until midterms. Gabe DeBenedetti and Hunter Walker, thanks to you both.
Thanks for having me.